Carl Jung recorded something that still unsettles modern psychologists. When empaths finally heal their deepest internal wound, the people they draw into their lives change, not slowly, but instantly. This isn't optimism, wishful thinking, or pop psychology fluff. It's a shift so abrupt and so powerful that Jung described it as frightening. Yet there's a crucial part no one ever talks about. The empath's central wound is never what it appears to be. And once that wound closes, the transformation in the kinds of people they attract isn't minor, it's total. Jung spent years working with empaths who entered his office completely shattered. They apologized for taking up space, believed they were responsible for every misfortune around them, and had become emotional punching bags for everyone in their lives. They absorbed a parent's alcoholism, a partner's betrayal, their family's dysfunction, quietly, continuously, without complaint, always trying to be better so the pain would stop. What made Jung's findings revolutionary was the hidden pattern beneath this apparent fragility. These weren't random victims. They all shared a rare psychological structure. They possessed what Jung called differentiated intuitive perception, the capacity to read micro-expressions, sense buried emotions, and decode psychological patterns that others missed entirely. Jung tested this repeatedly. He would bring colleagues into the room without any introduction, and within minutes, these empaths could describe their childhood wounds, relationship fears, and deepest insecurities with startling precision. One patient reached an accuracy rate of 97% when evaluating strangers. This wasn't magic. It was the human mind functioning at a level of emotional pattern recognition that most people never come close to accessing. Their sensitivity wasn't a flaw. It was a highly evolved form of consciousness. But Jung discovered something that permanently changed his understanding of the empath's psyche. These individuals weren't destroyed by their exposure to abuse. They had been studying it. Every one of them had built detailed internal maps of the people who'd hurt them. They understood their abusers' triggers, fears, motivations, and psychological architecture with laser-sharp detail. Their minds weren't repositories of suffering. They were strategic command centers lying dormant. And when the right internal trigger finally activated them, when the core wound healed, the entire trajectory of their lives shifted. The moment an empath's core wound heals, something remarkable happens. The soft-spoken, self-doubting person everyone thought they could walk over becomes someone entirely different. Someone who cannot be manipulated anymore. Someone who suddenly attracts entirely new kinds of people into their life. Jung noted that this shift wasn't gentle or gradual. It was absolute. People who had spent years trapped in toxic dynamics suddenly exited them with clarity and precision. Empaths who once depended on others for emotional validation became self-contained almost overnight. Those who apologized for existing began setting boundaries so firm they stunned the very people who used to control them with ease. But here's the part most people never understand. The core wound of the empath is not what it appears to be. It isn't simply childhood trauma. It isn't just abandonment. According to Jung, the real wound is this. The empath learns to distrust their own perception so they can maintain relationships with people who cannot tolerate being seen accurately. Think about the weight of that. Empaths have extraordinary emotional perception. They read subtle cues, feel the shift in a person's mood, sense the truth behind someone's words. They detect lies the moment they're spoken. They see what others hide. Their brains are wired for rapid emotional pattern recognition. But culture trains them to treat this gift as a defect. Every time an empath articulates what they see, people dismiss them as overreacting. Sensitive, dramatic, too emotional. When they point out obvious dysfunction, they're told they're imagining things. When they accurately read someone's intentions, they're accused of judging too harshly. This conditioning starts early. A child says, "Mom seems sad even though she's smiling." The parent answers, "You're imagining it. Stop being so sensitive." At work, they say, "Something feels off about this person." They hear, "You're paranoid. Don't stir up trouble." After years of this, the empath learns a brutal lesson. My perception must be wrong. So they silence themselves. They shrink their intuition. They pretend they don't see what they clearly see. And that becomes the wound that dictates exactly who they attract. When an empath suppresses their truth, they become a magnet for people who need someone blind. Manipulators, emotional parasites, and narcissists all gravitate toward those who see everything yet continually doubt themselves. It's not coincidence, it's instinct. Predators sense suppressed intuition the same way wolves sense a limping deer. Jung observed this pattern endlessly. The manipulator behaves hurtfully. The empath feels it immediately. But instead of trusting their perception, they question it. The manipulator reinforces this doubt. The empath suppresses their truth to preserve the relationship. And the cycle repeats. New person, same pattern. With every repetition, the empath becomes more convinced that their inner knowing is defective. This is why so many empaths end up apologizing excessively, not because they are weak, but because they've been trained to believe their natural perception harms others. But Jung discovered something no one expected. This pattern does not end with slow healing. It ends with one single, seismic moment. A betrayal so undeniable, so unmistakably obvious, that the empath cannot suppress their perception anymore. They recognize every sign they ignored, every intuition they buried, every red flag they talked themselves out of seeing. That blast of clarity snaps the wound in half, and the empath is never the same again. When that moment of undeniable betrayal hits, something extraordinary happens inside the empath. It isn't the pain that transforms them. It's the realization that they saw the truth the entire time. They felt every shift, sensed every lie, noticed every inconsistency long before it became obvious, yet chose to doubt themselves instead of trusting their own perception. In that instant, everything reconnects. Every warning their intuition whispered, every strange feeling they brushed aside, every detail they dismissed because someone insisted they were imagining things. The empath suddenly understands that their perception was never the problem. Their self-doubt was. Jung called this the clarity event, a psychological snap in which the empath's pattern recognition overrides the learned need to give others the benefit of the doubt. Something reorganizes internally, and what emerges is someone who is no longer willing to betray themselves. What stunned Jung was how these empaths reacted. He expected tears, emotional collapse, or frantic searching for explanations. Instead, they became still, almost unnervingly calm. They stopped apologizing. They stopped explaining. They stopped negotiating with dysfunction. Then they began speaking with precision. They described exactly what had been happening in the relationship, piece by piece, without anger, without panic, without hesitation. They laid out timelines, repeated conversations, emotional patterns, and behavioral inconsistencies with the accuracy of a forensic analysis. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't dramatic. It was truth delivered plainly, supported by years of silent observation. This shift wasn't a loss of empathy. It was the integration of intelligence they had been trained to suppress. Jung understood that this was the moment when the empath reclaimed the parts of themselves they had banished in order to keep relationships intact. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is not the dark side of the person. It is the set of qualities they were taught to hide. For empaths, the shadow contains their strongest abilities, their sharp intuition, their ability to read emotional currents, their psychological insight, their capacity to understand motives, their instinct to sense danger before it is visible. When these qualities rejoin the conscious personality, the empath becomes whole. They are no longer split between seeing clearly and pretending not to. Their intuition and their behavior finally match. And once this happens, the empath changes the kinds of people they attract. Jung followed many of these individuals after their clarity event. What he saw was life-altering. Empaths who had spent years trapped in toxic dynamics began thriving in every area. They built successful careers because they understood people more accurately than most professionals. They entered healthy relationships because they could identify emotional predators in minutes. Their decision-making became sharp and intuitive because they no longer second-guessed their inner signals. What shocked Jung the most was this: the healed empath did not become colder or more detached. They became more compassionate, yet far more discerning. They could still read people with extreme accuracy, but now they chose consciously what to engage with. Their empathy stopped being a weakness and became a skill. They also gained a new kind of power, the ability to influence social situations with ease. They understood the motivations, fears, and emotional needs of others with such clarity that they could have used this insight manipulatively, but they didn't. Their ethics remained intact. They simply stopped giving energy to those who exploited them. Jung referred to this final stage as the integrated empath, a person with deep sensitivity and equally deep boundaries, someone who feels everything, understands everything, and chooses wisely where to place their attention. And this is the moment where the attraction dynamic flips, not slowly, but immediately. Manipulators sense the change and withdraw. Narcissists lose interest because they can no longer create confusion. Emotional parasites are repelled because there is nothing left to feed on. Meanwhile, grounded, self-aware individuals feel comfortable, safe, and seen. The empath hasn't changed who they are. They have stopped abandoning themselves. That shift alone changes every relationship that enters their life. Before an empath heals, they consistently attract three kinds of people: manipulators who need someone to control, emotionally dependent individuals who need someone to stabilize them, and wounded empaths who bond through shared pain. After healing, this pattern doesn't shift slowly, it flips like a switch. Jung explained the mechanism behind this reversal. When empaths doubt their own perception, they operate in a state he called participation mystique. Their emotional boundaries dissolve and they merge with the feelings of others. They absorb sadness, tension, anxiety, and unspoken fears without realizing where those emotions originate. This creates a signal they broadcast without words: I have no defenses. You can unload anything onto me. That energetic openness attracts people who unconsciously look for someone to carry their emotional burden. Manipulators, narcissists, and emotionally chaotic individuals feel an immediate pull toward this unprotected sensitivity. They don't consciously plan it. They simply sense an opening and step into it. When empaths begin healing their core wound, everything shifts internally. They start distinguishing between their own feelings and the emotions they've absorbed. They learn to observe without taking ownership. They begin recognizing when their intuition is speaking quietly beneath someone else's influence. This new clarity creates a boundary that may be invisible, but it is unmistakably firm. An integrated empath can still feel others, but they no longer lose themselves in the process. They notice emotional truth in a room, yet they remain centered. They understand someone's intentions, yet they decide whether that insight requires action. Their sensitivity becomes guided by choice rather than compulsion. Jung witnessed this shift in one of his most documented cases. Before integration, the woman left every conversation drained, carrying emotional baggage that wasn't hers. After integration, she could sit with people who were distressed and remain grounded. She listened fully, yet walked away without feeling depleted. Nothing numbed her sensitivity. She simply stopped confusing empathy with responsibility. This new way of operating sends out a very different signal. I see clearly, but I'm not available for dysfunction. This is where the attraction dynamic transforms instantly. Manipulators sense the change the moment they interact with a healed empath. They attempt their usual tactics: guilt, pressure, subtle emotional manipulation, and it has no effect. The empath gives no emotional reaction. They simply state the truth with calm firmness. A simple sentence like, "I understand what you're trying to do, and it won't work on me," creates a powerful shift in the manipulator's psyche. It is not aggressive. It is not dramatic. It is clarity. And clarity removes their power. Because of this, manipulators instinctively withdraw. They feel exposed, uncomfortable, and unable to operate. It is not the empath who pushes them away. It is the manipulator who senses this new boundary and loses all access to the person they once controlled. Authentic people, however, respond in the opposite way. They feel safer than ever. They recognize that the empath is no longer absorbing everything or abandoning themselves. They can be honest without fearing emotional collapse or judgment. This dynamic creates grounded, meaningful connection. Jung referred to this state as love with boundaries, a balanced form of empathy rooted in self-respect. The integrated empath can care deeply without sacrificing their well-being. They can be compassionate without losing themselves in someone else's chaos. Jung also warned that the transformation has potential pitfalls that can lead the empath off course. The first is the inflation trap. When empaths discover their inner power, they sometimes begin to see themselves as above others. They mistake their perception for superiority. They begin viewing people as unconscious or unenlightened rather than simply human. This creates a new imbalance, because identification with the gift is just as unhealthy as suppressing it. The second is withdrawal disguised as wisdom. Some empaths respond to their new clarity by isolating completely. They convince themselves that they've outgrown everyone. Jung recognized this as spiritual avoidance. True integration doesn't lead to isolation. It leads to intentional relationships and conscious participation in life. The third pitfall is the helper's high. Some empaths build their identity entirely around helping others. They prioritize supporting everyone else so intensely that they stop doing their own inner work. Jung saw this repeatedly. Empaths becoming caretakers of others' healing while ignoring their own continued growth. Each of these pitfalls reflects the same issue: losing balance. Integration requires maintaining clarity without superiority, boundaries without isolation, and empathy without self-sacrifice. The fully healed empath doesn't withdraw from the world. They navigate it with awareness. They understand who deserves their energy. They recognize who they must avoid. They approach relationships with discernment instead of fear. And this steady, grounded presence is what resets every attraction pattern in their life. They no longer draw people who seek to drain them. They attract people who value truth, depth, accountability, and mutual respect. The empath hasn't become someone new. They have returned to who they were all along. Jung discovered something few psychologists were willing to acknowledge. Most empaths don't become powerful through slow, gradual healing. They transform during a single decisive moment, when the truth they've been avoiding finally becomes impossible to ignore. It isn't the betrayal itself that changes them. It's the realization that their intuition warned them long before anything happened. That they saw the signs clearly, recognized the emotional patterns, and still silenced themselves to protect the relationship. When this recognition finally hits, the shift inside them is immediate and irreversible. Jung described it as the clarity event, a psychological snap where all the suppressed perception, intuition, and intelligence they'd been holding back comes online at once. Empaths stop doubting themselves. They stop trying to justify the behavior of people who mistreat them. They stop softening truths that were always accurate. Instead of breaking down, they become calm in a way that unsettles the people who once controlled them. They begin naming patterns with precise accuracy. They speak truth without anger, but with the authority of someone who finally trusts their own mind. They list the manipulations, contradictions, and emotional games they endured, not emotionally, but analytically. It is the moment their shadow reintegrates into their personality. In Jungian terms, the shadow contains everything a person has repressed: intuition they were told was wrong, intelligence they were taught to hide, and strength they were encouraged to shrink. When empaths integrate their shadow, They reclaim the parts of themselves that were sacrificed to keep dysfunctional relationships alive. They no longer pretend not to see. They no longer apologize for understanding human behavior more accurately than most people can tolerate. This reintegration marks the beginning of what Jung called psychological completeness, and that completeness reshapes their entire life. Jung followed these individuals for years after their turning point and saw a consistent pattern. Their careers advanced because they could interpret emotional dynamics with almost surgical precision. They formed healthier relationships because they recognized harmful intentions long before others noticed them. Their decision-making improved because they no longer questioned their intuitive insights. What fascinated Jung even more was that their empathy didn't diminish. It matured. They could still sense emotions with remarkable depth, but now they used that ability strategically. They didn't absorb other people's chaos. They understood it and decided consciously how to respond. They became both compassionate and self-protective, deeply feeling yet firmly grounded. This new balance produced an unmistakable energetic shift. Manipulative people no longer felt comfortable around them. Jung called this instinctive avoidance the predator instinct. Manipulators couldn't articulate why they backed away. They simply sensed that the empath was no longer accessible. Their usual tactics fell flat. Their attempts at guilt or deception met steady resistance rather than confusion. They felt exposed, and exposure is fatal to manipulation. Meanwhile, stable and self-aware individuals felt drawn to these transformed empaths. They sensed clarity instead of chaos, boundaries instead of absorption, and compassion grounded in strength rather than self-erasure. Jung described this new expression of empathy as love with boundaries, a way of caring without losing oneself. The healed empath becomes a person who listens deeply, but no longer serves as a container for other people's emotional disorder. Jung also warned that reaching this state requires avoiding certain traps. The first is inflation, when empaths start believing their insight makes them superior. This leads to disconnection rather than integration. The second is isolation disguised as wisdom, pulling away from everyone under the belief that no one is conscious enough. Jung saw this as fear of engagement, not enlightenment. The third trap is defining one's entire identity around helping others, which prevents continued personal development. True integration doesn't lead to superiority or withdrawal. It leads to discernment. The healed empath participates in the world, interacts consciously, chooses relationships intentionally, and maintains a strong connection to their inner truth. This integrated state requires maintenance. Jung outlined several practices: spending time alone to separate personal emotions from absorbed ones, deciding intentionally when to use perceptive abilities, continuing inner work to avoid projecting hidden material, maintaining supportive relationships with grounded people, and expressing creativity to release emotional energy. These practices allow the empath to maintain sovereignty, Jung's term for psychological wholeness. Sovereignty is the ability to feel deeply without being controlled by emotion, to see clearly without needing to fix everything, and to remain connected without losing individuality. A sovereign empath becomes someone who cannot be manipulated and does not need to overextend themselves to feel worthy. Jung emphasized that healed empaths do not become different people. They become themselves without distortion. The qualities they once viewed as weaknesses reveal themselves as strengths. Their sensitivity becomes intelligence. Their intuition becomes guidance. Their emotional range becomes wisdom. The very traits that once made them targets become the traits that make them powerful. For Jung, the empath's transformation was never about becoming harder or colder. It was about learning to see clearly and respond consciously. Their role is not to carry the world's emotional weight, but to embody a form of awareness that elevates both themselves and those around them. The empath's greatest challenge is realizing that their depth was never the problem. Their lack of boundaries was. He believed that such individuals are essential for the evolution of consciousness. When an empath heals, they don't simply protect themselves. They alter their relationships, their environment, and often the emotional health of the groups they belong to. Their clarity forces others to confront truth. Their boundaries require others to grow. Their presence becomes a stabilizing force. Jung concluded that the empath's transformation is one of the most powerful psychological shifts a person can undergo. It is not about becoming less sensitive, but becoming sensitive with precision. It is not about needing less connection, but choosing connection wisely. It is not about suppressing depth, but using it consciously. The integrated empath becomes a person who navigates life with perception, strength, and authenticity. They no longer betray themselves to be loved. They no longer confuse empathy with sacrifice, and they no longer allow their gifts to be used against them. They become sovereign, and once that happens, nothing in their relational world remains the same. Jung found that a healed empath doesn't become a different person. They become the version of themselves that existed before self-doubt and conditioning taught them to hide their perception. Their transformation is not about gaining new abilities, but reclaiming the ones they were trained to suppress. Sensitivity becomes intelligence. Intuition becomes direction. Emotional depth becomes clarity. What once made them vulnerable becomes their greatest source of strength. He saw that the empath's evolution naturally leads to sovereignty, a grounded sense of self that cannot be manipulated, guilt-tripped, or psychologically absorbed into someone else's chaos. This state is not coldness, it is emotional maturity. The empath can feel deeply without falling apart and see clearly without taking responsibility for everyone's dysfunction. They protect their energy without losing compassion, but sovereignty requires upkeep. Jung emphasized solitude to separate personal emotions from absorbed ones, continuous inner work to prevent projection, intentional choices about when to engage deeply, and relationships with people who offer genuine stability. Creative expression also became essential, giving their highly perceptive inner world a place to move and breathe. Once the empath stabilizes in this integrated state, their entire relational ecosystem shifts. Manipulative personalities lose access immediately. Their old tactics no longer work, not because the empath fights harder, but because the entry points are gone. Healthy people move closer, drawn to the clarity and grounded presence that healed empaths naturally radiate. Their relationships become mutual, honest, and growth-oriented. Jung believed this transformation was vital for human development. When empaths heal, they don't just protect themselves, they elevate every environment they touch. Their boundaries teach others responsibility. Their clarity exposes avoidance. Their steadiness strengthens the people who rely on them. They become anchors, not absorbers. Most importantly, Jung insisted that the empath's sensitivity was never the flaw. The real problem was how long they spent doubting it. Healing is the moment they stop shrinking. Integration is the moment they stop apologizing. Sovereignty is the moment they finally trust their perception and live from their depth rather than hiding it. A healed empath doesn't become harder. They become unmistakably themselves. And once they reach that point, both the people they attract and the life they build transform accordingly.